Hello, and welcome to the Tidal Cyber Fireside Chat series. We got this covered, an attack coverage introspection. In this series, we talk about all the goods and the bads of attack, all the goods and bads of doing attack coverage, what that means to different people within the industry. Today, we have with George from SCYTHE to discuss specifically his lessons learned as a longtime attack practitioner, somebody that's flipped around from both end user space to the vendor space, and been able to use attack in both. Want to get his impressions on how to communicate, how to map with attack, and really anything else that might help the community better understand how to effectively use attack coverage. And so with that, George, why don't you introduce yourself?
Thank you very much for having me, Frank. Hello, everyone. My name is Jorge Orchilles. I am the Chief Technology Officer here at SCYTHE. I am also a SANS instructor and author and Purple Team ambassador for their Purple Team courses. Prior to SCYTHE, I worked 10 years, whole decade, at Citigroup, running the offensive team, which included red teaming and building out one of the first Purple Team programs in the financial industry space way back in 2015, right when attack was coming out. So I went from very much Excel spreadsheets of test cases to much more mature ways of measuring this, and all the lessons learned from going from vulnerability assessment to testing TTP. So hopefully I can bring some value to this conversation, and lots of lessons learned.
Yeah, no, I'm sure that there's going to be a ton to talk through on that, and I'm sure I could talk for hours on that background, because like I know that you and I go back a ways, but there's a lot of your history that would probably be super fascinating. Somebody that lived through the Excel spreadsheet days up through being now a vendor using attack as well. So with that, before we get started too much, why don't you give a little bit of an intro for SCYTHE for those that aren't intimately aware? I'm sure a lot of people are, but why don't you give a little bit of an overview about what SCYTHE is trying to do?
Perfect. Yeah. So SCYTHE is a platform. It's for doing adversary emulation. So if you are a red teamer or coming from the offensive side, it's essentially an enterprise grade command and control framework, which there's a lot of, right? Shout out to C2 Matrix with over 100 of them. But the value add here is that as an operator and using most of those C2s, you're manually doing a lot of things over and over, which removes consistency and reliability. So what SCYTHE can do, and really the value add other than being a C2, is that you can actually automate these attack chains. And every time you run them, they will reliably and consistently execute. A lot of folks say it's a BAS, a breach and attack simulation. We do a little different. We don't require you to deploy virtual machines or agents ahead of time. Essentially, we build a payload, or you build a payload as the operator. Yes, there's still an operator. You cannot automate an entire offensive team, unfortunately. So the operator creates a campaign, creates an attack chain, which we'll jump into a little more here. And then they actually execute that on a particular system. It connects to a SCYTHE server through command and control, and then automates all the procedures that you've decided to do. And of course, that links back to MITRE ATT&CK techniques at the technique level, and a number of other frameworks and whatnot. So that's the quick elevator speech on what SCYTHE is and how we're helping folks out there easily emulate these attacks and hopefully detect and respond to them much quicker than they do today.
No, definitely appreciate that background, and I know SCYTHE does a great deal and have been longtime users of attack. Before we go too far down this attack chain, wanted to recognize one of the plugs you just made there, because I think that it is actually a really fascinating thing. And from attack evals, right, I always got the question of like who won and things like that. And there's always this nice analog that I thought of in terms of the C2 matrix that you brought up. Why don't you just do a little bit of an intro just so people can understand what you meant there by the C2 matrix, because I think that is a really interesting initiative.
Yep. So the C2 Matrix is a free open source project open to any contributor. It started when I was still at Citi and actually writing my SANS course, the Red Team Operations course. Now it's a 6-day course. And we were using Empire because in a classroom environment, you want a reliable tool to use so that the students aren't troubleshooting and banging their head because something's not working. And Empire is probably one of the most known C2s. So they actually announced that they were going out of support, end of life. Now Empire is supported by the folks at BC Security, but back then, 2019, I'm trying to figure out what other C2s there are, and I started asking around and got 7 different answers, and some were pretty cool. So essentially, just started as a spreadsheet of C2s, and then as I actually went to the last DerbyCon, still with City, was starting to use SCYTHE there. I met with Bryson, and we were just talking about his talk, about other C2s, and came up with the idea of like, hey, instead of just a list of C2s, why don't we like actually test them all out and document their capabilities and their features? So it started like that, and now it's grown quite a bit. So apart from being a list of all known command and control frameworks, like Empire, right, like Sliver, like SCYTHE, there's 102 of them right now. I actually need to add 2 more to them that I'm pending looking at a few things. And it just mentions all their features, right? So C2 is used by a operator. When they gain initial access to a system, they need to have control to that endpoint to do things. Without command and control, you essentially have to build a worm. And we all know what happens when that occurs, right? We mandatory bringing up Stuxnet. It's now been 0 days since we brought that up. But also not Petya and WannaCry, right? We don't see them too often because you lose control of them. You need command and control to be in control. I'm guessing defining a word with the same word. So yeah, and most of them are manually operated, right? So you get your shell and then you type in what you want to do, right? And here's where we go to procedure level and say, you want to run a technique and find out what user you are. You run, who am I? Oh, that's T1033, right? So that's the C2 matrix. Now there is a virtual machine which has like 8 C2s already installed. There's a how-to, so if you've never used them, essentially trying to lower the learning curve, because a lot of these are out there, they're free, they're on GitHub. Yes, they're a little bit of a pain to install and get up and running, but malicious actors are using it, so you should probably be able to look at some of these to be able to detect them when they use them against your environment.
Yeah, no, and I really like the fact that you guys did go to the efforts of trying to dissect the features and the capabilities that they do, because just like with defensive solutions, right, it so much comes down to figuring out which one is right for you. Like, what are the capabilities you specifically need? What's the strategy that you want to implement? What in the case of what C2 platform, like what threats are you trying to emulate? What's your goals? Again, if you're going instructor, maybe it's one. If you're trying to go novel for your defenders, maybe it's going with a different one, right? And so there's just a lot to pull on. So I thought that was a really interesting initiative, and glad we could at least touch on that a little bit. But to jump back a step, you had started to go down this path of so SCYTHE thinks in the world of procedures and ties them back to attack techniques as well. Interested in history with using MITRE ATT&CK, and this could be twofold. It could be you. It could be a little bit about how SCYTHE uses it as well. But where did you get started using ATT&CK? You mentioned that you had been using it for some time.
Yeah, so back at City, started the red team there. Essentially, we weren't, and the big difference between red team and penetration testing, right, is that we're not just exploiting vulnerabilities. But for the previous, 10 years, our focus in the offensive team there was finding vulnerabilities, rating them, right? CVSS, I'm a contributor and author for 3 and 3.1. And we had gotten to the point where we had a nice process in place. A vulnerability exists on system A. It has a CVSS of this. You have so long to patch it. And then when they patched it, we would test it, or change the configuration. We would test it and close the issue, right? A lot of focus on prevention. As we built out the red team, we tried to stay away from exploits. And now all of a sudden we have a list of what we call test cases, which we now call procedures, of things that we did. And the whole metric around it wasn't whether you could do it or not. Essentially, most of these you cannot prevent. And that mind shift of it's not going to be closed ever. It's going to have to be detected. Well, how do we detect it? Well, now we need to bring in the operating system team to ensure we have the right logs, maybe the EDR team, the AV team. EDR wasn't even a thing back then. Maybe the AV team, maybe the Splunk team or whatever SIM, what, make sure we get the logs across. Well, first log locally, then get the logs across, then have an alert, then train the team to actually do something. And they're like, but when are we going to close this issue? It's like, well, we can't. We can only make the detection better. We can, first see it, right? At least the instant response people would be able to see it once they get on a system that they think was compromised. Then get it to the point where the folks doing the monitoring, the SOC level 1, level 2, would be able to see it, at least have it centrally logged. And then, of course, creating alerts and doing this in an organization where you have around 1.2 million internal systems. There's a lot of noise. So there's a lot of tuning that you have to do and a lot of work there. So it was a huge shift, right? And when they originally started, it would be like this test case, right? Let's say like command and control out to the internet, since we talked a little bit about that, right? There was only one method to detect that back in the day before we had EDR, right? There was essentially a proxy or a firewall that would see that traffic. So we would match it with like one detective control and then try to get it so that it was green so that, they saw it. But as we know now, right, command and control can be done a million different ways. So talking at that tactic level wasn't good. Then we started getting down to technique level where it's like, okay, it's now SSH. Oh, SSH, we actually block outbound because we have a proxy and only allows these things out. Good, we prevented something. What about HTTP and HTTPS? Oh, we can't prevent that. So how do we detect that? Well, and then there's where we started getting a little deeper into the techniques. And then, back in the day, I don't know if this actually happened, but I think there was like only one procedure, or at some point there was the thought that there was only one procedure per technique. So it became like a bingo card. We got that one. And nowadays, obviously, that has all changed. So essentially, to answer your question, it started as Excel, and then it grew and grew and grew. And then we essentially took our GRC platform, which I don't even want to say the name. It's a curse word. I don't want to say bad words on this, but essentially customized it to a point that we can track these things instead of open and close and high, low, medium risk to actually, detected, not detected, alerted, etc.
That's really cool. And so you went through this very organic way of pretty much repeating a lot of the history of attack itself, right? When we dealt with like, okay, let's have red team operations, they're executing this thing, but now our analytics are brittle. So how do we abstract the thing to developing it? Like, and right, it is very similar, just practical nature of it. And one of the things that I love that you just talked about there is like, even back in your more vulnerability pen testing kind of experience, it was still a very purple team experience, it sounded like. So very, very cool to think of how much purple team you were leveraging long before it was the hot term in cyber. So that's really, really cool.
So once we started measuring and, once everyone realized we can't prevent it, we had done maybe 4 red team exercises and our improvement was close to nothing. And that is when our CISO, awesome CISO, by the way, Charles Blonner, he's not there anymore, is like, I need a way to like show that you're bringing value, because running 4 ops and being successful is not saying anything at this point. And then that's where the metrics started. And then that's where we all got together and like, we're all right, let's work together. Let me show you how this works. You show me how that works, because, the red team making up recommendations, probably not the best way to go about this. Let's all work together. So yeah, that was back and I actually found it. I did a presentation. It was a closed session presentation at SCYTHE in 2016 after we had ran a couple of exercises, I'm like, I gotta tell someone about this. No, you cannot do that. You cannot speak about Fight Club outside of Fight Club. So went to SCYTHE, and I actually found that presentation. I'll send it over to you later. It's on GitHub now.
No, definitely appreciate that. We can share that out there. That's a wonderful story. But you bring up a wonderful aspect of attack, right? Which is the well, wonderful and terrible at the same time. So the how to communicate your progress and your results. And you even mentioned the green cell. And so the history of, or I mean, attack was developed for the exact reason you're mentioning, right? We had to have a way of communicating our progress up to leadership. When I was back at MITRE, obviously, we had to have a way of communicating results of our red team, blue team engagements, our progress that we're having in our detection engineering and research, what we're testing, why we're testing it, what the results are, and show how we're doing incremental improvements, right? So outcomes attacked, which quickly turned into the stoplight chart, right? Because we had these things that last time we tested that were yellow, and we had to show that we had made improvements. So let's turn them green. And so out you get this stoplight chart, which I think was a significant part of why attack picked up traction initially, because it was just resonated with people. They could show this, right? But then we quickly realized how ineffective that was because of the procedural challenges that you also bring up. So bottom line is like going back a little bit through time with attack, we learned a lot about attack coverage, the do's and the don'ts. And so I wanted to kind of get your perspective, right? Especially as someone at an organization that's so heavily focused down on procedures over the last 6 months or a year. Like what when you hear about attack coverage, like what's kind of your impressions of it? What's your thoughts on it? Yeah.
Yeah, and that's the thing. I think that's one of the issues, right, with attack is the coverage, and what is your coverage is a very hard to define. And that is because a technique or a sub-technique can have many different procedures. And while you might detect, the example we give is who am I, right? Yeah, T1003, you want to know what user is there. You can run who am I on command prompt. You can run who am I in PowerShell. You can call the API, right? Like there's a bunch of ways of doing it. So originally it was like, oh, someone runs who am I? We can detect that. We actually get an alert because lots of people don't do that. And it's not even that noisy. So this is great. All the attackers do this early on. We got it. All right, green for T1033. And then we see another actor that we're tracking using a different way. And then, yes, it goes back and we test that way. And no detection. It's using the API. We don't have EDR on that box, or the EDR might not be hooking that API call. No visibility whatsoever. Do we go red? Well, probably not, right? Because we still detect who am I, but we're doing this at the technique level. So how do we do that math, right? And then it gets even more complex nowadays, right? I was talking about back in the day. Now we do have EDRs, right? So you consider, all right, now we have a detection for that. It shows up on the EDR. That's great. The EDR takes 15 minutes to get there. How do we show that? And then what happens if they bypass the EDR? Is there another compensating control that might be able to detect that? Then how do we measure that? So this is a thing that we've been working quite a bit on. I actually probably haven't talked to you about this at all, but keeping my CVSS mindset and coming up with crazy algorithms. How can we do that with attack and procedures and like all the math there? And do we need to know all the procedures to be able to even do this? And the answer is yes, which is very hard to track. So yeah, there's good and bad, right? The great is that we now have a common language, right? We were able to share this across cyber threat intel, and some response does something, they can talk to us in the same language. Even if it doesn't map perfectly, that's fine. Like saw Microsoft put out a report on putting something in an ISO, and they put it as like deploy container. I'm like, that's not it. But that's fine because you know, I kind of know what you're talking about. I read a little more, and okay, you put in an ISO, got it. It's actually marked with the web bypass, by the way, for anyone tracking. But you know, it still allowed us that nice way to talk. So big pros there. Coverage, though, that is very difficult to get to today. I don't think we have a solution. I think we do need to come up with some sort of scoring system, but it will be, and you will have to do it in your environment. Everyone that talks smack about CVSS, right, and the distribution, I asked, did you calculate it for your environment? There is an environmental and temporal score. Did you do those? No, I'm looking at the base score. I'm like, well,
got to miss a few dimensions there.
Exactly.
Yeah, and you touched on a lot of different points there, and very valuable points, right? I mean, I just did a talk at DEF CON around being able to recognize the value and the limitations of attack, right? I think that from my standpoint, I think that attack serves a good perspective of being able to abstract it to a level. It's not going to be as accurate as going down to the procedure level, but you need to have a little bit of both, right? You need to be able to have the abstract so you can communicate. You need to be able to have the detail so you can be accurate. And so you need to figure out how to bridge these two worlds of procedures and techniques. And I do love that about like what a lot of what SCYTHE is communicating about. It's the importance of procedures while still not losing focus that attack does have this value. You just have to understand really what its limitations and values are. And similarly, another point that you brought up, which is like the defense, right? So you've got the complexity of the threat, but you also have the complexity of defense when you're talking about coverage, right? Because there's protections, there's detections, there's responses, and what do you have as an organization? And that's one of the things that Tidal's trying to illuminate a little bit with our product registry. So, right, we have this community edition of our platform that we just released. SCYTHE is part of that, as well as a number of other vendors, and we're going to continue to have other vendors come in. But what they do is they map their capabilities into attack to say, this is how we address this threat. This is how we mitigate, protect, detect, respond, or test even a given technique. And so one of the things that I wanted to touch on is recognizing the limitations of attack and coverage. SCYTHE still participated in this and was wondering what resonated with Tidal's effort that made you guys want to come aboard.
Yeah, I like that it's all in one place, especially because folks don't have that, right? And something that SCYTHE has been looking at is, you know, attack, detect, and respond, right? And you need to have those capabilities first before you bring people into it, right? That they're trained and actually know what to do. So you're kind of mapping that as well, kind of helping folks get trained up and know what's available from the get-go versus what they can do and not find later, right? I think that was, you know, just on the EDR side, that was like a big thing about evaluations. And now you're kind of taking it through the full spectrum of attack, detect, and response. So it's very, very much on point with how we feel and how we think, which, you know, pretty innovative, as you've always been, Frank, and the whole team over there. So I'm loving it. I've been taking a look at it since it came out last week. Last week was a little rough with Black Hat, DEF CON, and B-Sides Las Vegas, but I did have a chance to click around a little bit, and we'll definitely be looking at it a lot more. And
I definitely appreciate that. Yeah, product launches at Black Hat are I guess necessary evil, but yeah, I'm glad to have you guys be a part of it. And to that end, right, we've got SCYTHE in the platform. We haven't talked a ton about SCYTHE and how you guys think about coverage from a corporation, more what your history is. So wondering what kind of takeaways do you have from SCYTHE in terms of what you would consider attack coverage? When somebody ask you that question, like what do you guys look at it? How do you guys approach it?
Yeah, so we do not focus on initial access, right? So that is an area that changes quite a bit. It's also an area where you have lots of exploitation, and exploitation by definition is risky. So most of our customers run SCYTHE in their production environment. And that's why, you know, I mentioned before, the whole automated pen tests and automated exploitation is downright scary in a production environment. I don't know how many people actually sign off on that. I know a large financial definitely will not. That was a whole big problem when we started doing pen testing. They're like, you're going to exploit a production system? That system moves more money in a day than you'll make in your lifetime. I don't think so. We're not focused on that initial access part. We do build a shell, some shell code that an operator can then take and weaponize. You can put in a maldoc. You can run it, through a million lolbasses, MS builds, whatever you want to do with it. Essentially, that part we see that will be very much human driven for the foreseeable future, right? You will still need someone to figure out what version of Office someone's running, package it, not get caught by the millions of security controls in the way, and then run it, right? But then once you do get code to execute on the system, that is our focus. So, of course, if we're talking MITRE ATT&CK, we're not talking about that initial access, but everything behind it. And there, yeah, the coverage, of course, yes, you want the technique level coverage, but to do a technique and flag as you do that technique, you have a procedure. So our focus is definitely on the procedure because that's what is actually being done. And then tagging that to a technique as best as we can, of course. It is a modular platform. So the more advanced red team operators that use it can build their own modules and do things that might not even be on attack yet, right? We did that with the cloud modules when we were putting those out. We're like, this doesn't map here, this doesn't map there. And of course, contribute to attack. I know we spent a lot of time saying the bad stuff, but contribute. Like the attack does allow you to talk to them and show them stuff, which we did. And they might get added on the next one, and there you have your technique and your technique coverage. But yeah, essentially everything we do is at the procedure level, and that's something from an industry perspective that we're not really getting. From a cyber threat intelligence perspective, from an incident response perspective, those reports might have technique mapping. Very few have procedure mapping. Shout out to the DFIR report. We love those folks. Definitely contribute to them if you can. Because they actually put procedures in there. What actually did the attacker do, right? Like run DLL. You can do that a million ways. Can we get as close to realistic as possible? And if so, then of course, building that attack chain, which we haven't even talked about. I don't know if we're gonna have time to, will be more realistic.
So before we go into the attack chain, and we can, if we so desire, I'll give you one more question in a second about where else, what other comments around attack do you have, and maybe we talk about that, maybe we don't, maybe we save it for another day. But one of the things that I did want to bring up is another challenge that you hit on when we talk attack coverage, and that's extensibility, right? If you just look at coverage, right, as is, you don't understand that a platform like SCYTHE is very extensible. And so being able to create new techniques isn't necessarily reflected if you just look at a simple thing like coverage. And just so I want to pinpoint that as just another recognition of a limitation. But that being said, a lot of people want to understand what your current coverage is and how you do that. And so to do that, I think we're currently leveraging a couple of repositories you guys have in GitHub. Can you explain what those repositories are so that they understand what's being reflected in the platform and what's not today?
Yeah, for sure. So when I started here, again, it was an adversary emulation platform. So a lot of the work that we were doing as operators was consuming cyber threat intelligence and building these threats, or what we will now be calling campaigns. And MITRE will be releasing campaigns in the October release. So we will all use the same word, which is fantastic. So a campaign is essentially an attack chain. A number of procedures that an attacker went through to get to their objective, right? And there's a big differentiator from things like Atomic Red Team, or even looking at MITRE ATT&CK as atomic tests, right? No attacker just types "who am I?" Like even typing just "who am I?" You're actually doing two techniques, right? Command line execution, and T1033 for user discovery. So when we get to that point, we're actually building out everything that's occurring. So command and control needs to be there, right? Something that Atomic doesn't have. And you can put these, even if you do atomic tests, put these procedures in an actual chain to see what occurs and how far you get before the detection kicks in, any of the detections. I've also talked to a lot of detection engineers, how they've been evolving of not building a control over just one procedure, but when a set of procedures occurs. For example, if we look at the Conti playbook that everyone kind of has seen already, right? They run whoami, they run NL test, they run netview / domain. Like, who in a real environment is going to run those 3 commands within a 10-minute period or 30-minute period, right? So that correlation actually helps you to bring down the noise. If you set up an alert just for whoami, you might get a lot of that in a particular environment, and you're going to be chasing non-actors. So we've been big fans of that, bringing together those attack chains and getting as close to what the threat actor does. So we have the community threats GitHub, which is the largest public repository of adversary emulation plans. And then we have compound actions, which are essentially our atomics. The reason for that is that we have a chicken and egg problem. When we find something new, for example, that ISO, putting like a shortcut inside of an ISO that then runs run DLL 32 on a DLL, that there was no atomic test for that. So we started playing it with it. I got it to work on site. We released it as a compound action, but it was already done. So we released it on Atomic Red Team as well. So each update, of course, we update site that has all of Atomic Red Team, shout out to them. But then we have that chicken and egg problem, right? We find something, there's a month left for something to come out. We want our customers to be able to test it very quickly, right? That's something most folks get. And when they come back to work on Monday, like, hey, I saw there's this new attack on Cisco. Can we try that? Well, yes, you can. Here is that community threat, right? So those are all public facing, right? Everything that's on Tidal for Scythe right now is public facing. So it's community threats and compound actions. We also have a CTI team internally building custom plans and releasing things that we don't put out there for everyone. Because again, we have that chicken and egg problem of pushing out capabilities that not everyone might not have. And is it helping? Who's it helping more? So those debates we have quite a bit. And that's why we have the internal CTI team that goes to our customers. But yeah, we'll definitely work more with Tidal to get all of our internal capabilities that come with the platform that might not be on those GitHubs on there as well. That's our stage 2.
Yeah, definitely appreciate that, and appreciate you guys at least coming forward with the public stuff, and look forward to getting more and more in there, as well as working with you guys on things like campaigns and such, and how to better articulate that as a community. And so look forward to all that. And you did a pros pro thing there of actually touching on the last point, and I'll end it with so you started talking about campaigns and started alluding to these concepts of flows and the interconnectivity of techniques. And so in the last couple of minutes here, do you just want to touch on some of your thoughts around the interconnectivity between attack techniques versus the atomicness of it? Or is there anything else? I'll open the floor up more broadly of anything else that you want to touch on about attack or lessons learned to give the community before we exit this.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'll focus more on what attack is doing and how they're bringing it in the next update, because everyone's going to see it there. And again, it's something that we've been looking at as well. So right now in MITRE ATT&CK, you go to groups and you have, APT28, and you have a list of techniques and some of the procedures that were observed. Then you scroll all the way down, you look at the references, and there's like 20 of them, right? Which is great, but were all those the same campaign? They might have been attributed to the same actor, but not all done in a campaign. So essentially what the campaigns are going to do is say, this particular campaign, this particular breach, these were the procedures that we saw, obviously mapped to techniques and all that. And that way you can test that one. So APT28, for instance, could have 8 different campaigns that you test, and there will be a little variation from them, which just, gets us even to more and more details, right? Which I love. I think, that's another step forward, right? Especially when our product focuses on those attack chains in particular. I think it's a step in the right direction, not only because we've been doing it that way, but it's definitely the right way of looking at those. I'm looking at them as attack chains and not just singular atomic tests, because again, no one's just going to run who am I. They're going to have some C2, something's going to have happened before, something's going to happen after, and running them in that flow will definitely help you tune a lot better.
There is a lot to unravel there that I could probably spend the next hour or two talking with you about how to deal with procedural variants and statistics and all the goodness related around like the appropriate ways of testing and so many other things. But I'm going to resist the urge for the sake of our viewers in this one. But I do appreciate it, George. This has been absolutely wonderful, and getting some backstory from somebody again that's been living the attack world or very similar paths for as long as you have. So I definitely appreciate that. And we appreciate SCYTHE for being part of the registry, sharing their data with us, and trying to push transparency in industry, right? That's one of the big things we're trying to do at Tidal is just try to make it so that people can understand more about the threat, but also more about their options, right? How do they defend against them? How do they test against them? And so I definitely appreciate you being part of this. And thank you for all the people that have listened to this chat, as well as any of the other ones. If you've got any thoughts and feedback, feature requests, feel free to reach out to the Tidal team. We always appreciate that. And for now, that will conclude this fireside chat. And thank you so much, George.
Thank you.